I've created a last scene here to show you how to render out your images. I've generated these shapes with extrude. What I would say about the extrude is because the curves are still tied to the surfaces, you can manipulate the curves themselves, their position and their rotation, etc. And it will affect the way the surface appears. I would recommend, tweaking the profile curve, its rotation and its position relative to the rail curve when you extrude in order to get a cleaner result. What you also see here is I have one more little material trick to show you, and that's adding some default Maya texture if you'd like. And rather than a flat material color, you can add texture. And I've done that here. I've added a ramp, which is a gradient. So let me show you how to do that with this other object here, this set of objects. So I've just added a standard surface shader, and then this checker box next to any of these values allows you to link in another node. And in this case, we're going to link in a texture node. So if I click on this, I get create a render node. And there are some default textures here that you can play with. Some of the ones maybe I would avoid are movie. I would basically work ocean also. I mean, you can try these things out, but you could try rock, marble, leather, granite, but in this case, I'm going to choose ramp. And ramp is just a gradient value. And for this, I select either color, and I can choose I select either one of these values here, and I can choose a color. So maybe I'll say red on this side and pink on this side. And you can have the ramp wrap around the surface in what's called the V direction or the U direction. And I think I like the U so that it's wrapping horizontally rather than vertically around our object. It's really the direction of the mesh itself or of the surface itself that determines what's the U value and the V value. So I think this looks pretty good. I just would still like to put a background in, and rather than adding a plane in the background, and if you wanted to keep it purely surfaces, you could also add a surface plane, a NURBS plane rather than a polygon plane. Adding a NURBS plane in the background would keep your entire project NURBS based. But there are a couple other ways I can add some color to the background. And again, I'm going to be kind of tying in another node. If I go to my render settings, sorry, I went to window, but I want to go here to this clapboard to render settings. And I'd like to go to my Arnold tab here. In the Arnold tab, and we'll get into this, these are our different sample this is how many times the renderer will pass over the scene in order to try to calculate for certain conditions. And when you increase the value, you increase the render time, but also the quality. So you balance these things out. This is kind of an overall. So when we go ahead to do our final render, this will give us, if we increase this, it'll maybe adjust for things like noise, diffuse adjusts for maybe shadow noise, specular adjusts for noise in the specular highlights, transmission adjusts for noise in see-through objects, subsurfaced, SSS is subsurface scattering. So if you're using something like coat or some of the other parameters that are in the Arnold shaders, and then there's volume and direct. You don't have to necessarily worry about these, but maybe bumping up some of the values here if you see a lot of noise in particular areas in your final render. But what I wanted to do is put a background in my scene. So let me go to environment, and I can add a background here. And again, I'm going to check this checker box. And the first thing I can do is I can create a sky shader, and this adds, you can see here, something that's really similar to that Arnold light that we put in, sky dome. This adds a kind of sky dome. If I go to my attribute editor here, I can adjust the intensity of it. So this will also, this type of background will not only add color value to the background of your scene and give you something other than black, but it will also change it will apply a lighting scheme to your objects as well. So this may or may not be the kind of look I'm going for. Another way that I can make the background and add something to the scene that doesn't interact with or affect the objects in the scene. Go back to my render settings. And here again, I can, if I want to get rid of a node, a texture node, or likewise that if I want to remove this connection, I can right click over the name and say break connection, and that will get rid of that that connection and has removed that physical sky or sky shader. I can also create a ray switch shader, and this will, if I can now adjust for color, the camera's background color, but this will not interact with or affect the objects in the scene. I think I like my sky shader better, so let me break that connection. Again, add a sky shader. Choose that darker blue. And now I'm ready to render. So again, I have my render view running, which you can maybe hear in the background of the video. I'm going to maybe zoom in a little bit. And so I can maybe adjust for things like diffuse. When I'm looking at this overall, perhaps the shadows have a little noise, and this is getting into a lot of nuance and not necessarily something you have to worry about, but I'm just making you aware. It really depends on how high of quality renders you want to submit for your project. I would accept this, it's perfectly fine. Some noise is okay for me for this first project. But I would say let's go up to let's stop this now that I see that I like the way it looks overall, and let's go to our render view itself so we can process the full image. What I'd like to do first is do a test resolution maybe of 25%. And let's render. Maybe that's too small. Let's try again a test resolution at 50%. And now if I want to play with some of the sampling here, I'm going to create a marquee. Oops. I have to drag my marquee first. So this will render the full scene, but if I drag a marquee, click and drag around a particular area, let me increase the diffuse and now try to render it at 3 passes. And it doesn't seem to be affecting that shadow, so I'll bump that back down. Maybe I'll just do an overall camera anti-aliasing. That seems to have affected my shadows. Try subsurface scattering. Which I don't think, if it's subsurface, not going to affect the shadows. And it seems to have already processed and not showed us anything. But these are how you would adjust if there's some. Let's try specular. I don't think that affects shadows, but we can try. See if that will change. Let's increase our anti-aliasing time. And I think, let me take an image. If I click this little, again, if I click this keep image icon, I'm able to start a running queue so I can compare. And I do see quite a bit of difference just by increasing that anti-aliasing. So I think a value of 5 for just this one image will work well. And now, when I'm looking at my render view here, the size, because it's test resolution, now I'm ready to render this image out. I'm going to make sure I have render settings selected, but my render settings aren't right for the project yet. So let me go back to the common tab here. And then I'm going to say image 1, or maybe I can write, to, if you have a title name that you'd like to apply, you can title your work. And now image format, I'm going to choose JPEG. This name.extension single frame is the default, and we want to keep that. Renderable camera. And then our preset here, I just want to change this to HD 720. I can close this out, and now if I say render sequence, we will render our scene, and it will save the image. So I'll jump ahead to the end. So it's telling me I'm at 99% completed, and there's a little square here missing, but if I go to my Finder, and let's find my project folder. And again, it's going to be in my images folder. I see that I have my image rendered. So this would be my first submission. Something I'd say about this image is it contains some depth, and I would recommend incorporating, because depth is something that we can work with 3D quite easily, that you kind of exploit that capability perhaps, or you can work with its opposite and make things really flat, but just be aware that you have the possibility for having really great depth and to play with that as a formal strategy. I think having some interest in color and thinking really about the overall 2D composition of your 3 submissions would be important, and think about these as kind of abstract 2-dimensional images that you're creating. So good luck this week with project 1, and I really look forward to seeing what you put together.